I'm Afshin Rattansi and you're watching Going Underground. Coming up on the show, after UK, US, EU nation-armed Israeli airstrikes on Gaza and Syria, is the world complicit against international law? The UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories today, the day Palestinians would have gone to the polls, tells us Israel is liable for war crimes. And we investigate the origins of Islamophobia with an international human rights lawyer who tells us why we shouldn't fear a Muslim planet. All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground. But first, today would have been Palestinian presidential election day, but under an occupying power accused of war crimes after almost daily Israeli killing and multi-million-dollar aerial bombardment. All this as Pegasus revelations of Israeli spyware company NSO Group were overshadowed by the news that ice cream company Ben & Jerry's would stop selling ice cream in illegal Israeli settlements. Joining me now from Ontario in Canada is the UN's Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories, Professor Michael Link. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming back on. Let's just go straight to the letter that you and two other Special Rapporteurs calling for elections. They're not happening today after all. Have you spoken with Israel, or, after all, armed by Britain, the United States and European Union nations, that appears to say no elections in East Jerusalem?
I don't see any pressure, quite frankly, from the international community with respect to the rescheduling of these elections. We want these elections to be held, obviously, in as soon as possible, hopefully within the next 6 months. We would like, obviously, all the participating parties, Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, as well as the international community, to ensure that all Palestinians have a right to vote, a right to participate, and particularly those in occupied East Jerusalem, where Israel has made it very difficult to try to conduct the Palestinian elections.
I mean, obviously those in Palestine watching this right now will go, hang on a minute, there's been aerial bombardment every other day in Gaza, seemingly. Why are we talking about elections? Any response from the Israeli government to the letter?
No, but quite frankly, I'm not surprised. I have been in this position as Special Rapporteur for more than 5 years. I have never received a single a reply from Israel to any of the 75 or so statements that I've released, or any of the 10 reports that I've released, or any of the requests made by me to be able to visit the occupied Palestinian territory. They don't recognize the mandate, they don't engage in it, and they don't reply to anything that I write.
I mean, there have been some noises since Joe Biden was elected. Does the United States even recognize you as UN Special Rapporteur?
I've not heard anything with respect to that. I don't have a regular contact with the United States, though I'm hoping to, now that we have a president that, at least on paper, is more open to, I guess, recognizing some form of Palestinian rights. But we'll see down the line. I hope to be able to be in touch with the Americans for the next time I'm in Geneva and in New York.
You think Naftali Bennett will allow Joe Biden to put a U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem for the Palestinians?
I'm sure that's a debate that's going on within the Israeli government. In the end of the day, I can't see how the Israeli government can refuse the opening or reopening of the U.S. consulate. That's been there since before 1948, is my understanding, and it's simply a restoration to the status quo. Joe Biden has done attacked some of the issues that had been undone by the former president, such as he's restored aid to UNRWA, the Palestinian refugee agency run by the United Nations. He's attempting to try to reopen this consulate. He's restored funding to the Palestinian Authority in general.
I mean, in the news has been hundreds killed or wounded in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, obviously directly in your remit as these eviction processes are going. I think that on Monday a Supreme Court decision comes. But can I just quickly go to Gaza and ask you what you know of what is happening there, especially given Israel has been aerially bombarding it with weapons supplied to them and weapon parts from Britain, where I'm speaking to you from?
Sure. The most recent statement was made by the United Nations during a special meeting of the UN Security Council devoted to the Middle East. And the deputy UN coordinator stated that there's attempts now to evaluate the amount of damage done to Gaza, both to its economy and to its infrastructure. It's probably somewhere in the area of a $500 million of damage that was caused during the violence in May. There's an attempt to try to raise money, which is going slowly. among international donors to fund this again. There's attempts to try to be able to widen the amount of materials that are going into Gaza, both for construction and reconstruction, as well as just for the daily economy. But keep in mind, Gaza is flat on its back. Its economy is stagnant. It has among the highest unemployment rate of any geographic unit that the World Bank looks at around 50%. Its healthcare system is shattered, both by lack of equipment as well as by the rise in COVID cases. Its water is undrinkable. It's now up to about getting to around 14 hours a day of power each day, which is hardly enough to be able to restart an economy. Any economic development that goes on in Gaza usually is allowance of construction material to come in to repair what Israeli missiles have wound up destroying.
I mean, just on the journalism element, the fact that Israel has been carrying out airstrikes in the past few days or weeks, why do you think it doesn't even make the front pages of newspapers in the capitals of countries supplying the weaponry to bomb this area you speak of so sadly?
Sure. I'd like to think I don't have a cynical bone in my body with respect to this. How else would I do this job unless I'm an eternal optimist? But the question, then becomes, if it's not, if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead. Here we have more than 2 million people penned up behind a 14-year-old blockade that constitutes collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. And yet I can't think of a single other situation in the world where you have this number of people behind fencing and basically not able to move outside of that restricted area, and yet the level of attention given to the ongoing rights violations caused by this is minuscule.
Yeah, but if it bleeds, it leads. They are bleeding. I mean, what was it? How many were injured in the illegal Beta settlement just in the past few days? 150 wounded. Yeah. You call this the settlements war crimes?
Yes, and look, and that is not a hard thing to come by. I think any international lawyer looking at the definition of war crimes under the Rome Statute of 1998, which created the International Criminal Court, will see that the definition of an occupying power moving parts of its civilian population into the occupied territory is clearly, unambiguously defined as a war crime. And that language was directly borrowed from the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention and the 1977 additional protocols. And those earlier documents in international law that the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the UN Human Rights Council have repeatedly said Israel is in flagrant violation of. So it's no great logical step to say that if the settlements are a grave breach under the Fourth Geneva Convention, then using virtually the same language, they're a war crime under the 1998 Rome Statute.
Well, Israel obviously denies war crimes. The United States doesn't appear to really recognize the UN Human Rights Council, and presumably it's now up to the International Criminal Court to decide on the allegations of war crimes. Does that mean that any businesses here in Britain, say, or in the EU, if they are involved in settlement building or house destruction, are they facilitating war crimes?
Sure. I mean, the definition that was created in 1998 is quite broad. It says basically any actions directly or indirectly, those are the key words that are in the definition of war crimes in the Rome Statute, may amount to prosecution of those involved in it. So it would be obviously the Israeli military, political, and administrative leadership that has facilitated the creation of these settlements over the past 5 decades, but it could also involve international businesses that are involved directly or indirectly with the maintenance of the settlement economy. And we're now at a new understanding in international law that businesses may be culpable, may be liable for either civil suits or perhaps for war crimes if they're involved in a manner that winds up violating what our new understanding of war crimes constitutes. So British companies, international companies that are actively engaged in the settlements, please heed this warning.
So far from Unilever, the parent company of ice cream brand Ben & Jerry's having to apologize and say we oppose boycott, divestment, sanctions, they may thank those at Ben & Jerry's for getting them off the war crime liability because they're refusing to sell the ice cream now in the illegal settlements.
Sure, and you think on the one hand this is a tempest in a teapot. American ice cream maker is going to withdraw selling ice cream from the settlements, but you can see how the reaction of the Israeli government, the president of Israel has called this economic terrorism. The foreign minister has said this is a form of anti-Semitism. At some point, these arguments and these scare tactics are going to sound increasingly hollow. The settlements are clearly illegal under international law. Every single country in the world accepts that. And if they are illegal, a flagrant violation, according to the Security Council, and a war crime, then what are we doing allowing those settlement goods to come into the European market or the North American market? That economic oxygen given to them only allows them to continue to flourish. There are now around 700,000 Israeli settlers and somewhere between 250 to 300 settlements in occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank. That's the engine of the occupation, and that's the main reason for the continuation of the occupation, and that's the main obstacle to realizing genuine Palestinian self-determination, which the world says it is in favor of.
Well, they're in sports competitions, they're in the Eurovision Song Contest. I mean, just to be clear then, isn't Naftali Bennett a war criminal because he is involved clearly in what you describe as war crimes, i.e. the settlements?
Well, yes. I think the stretch of or the reach of the prosecutor's office at the International Criminal Court would go to, it doesn't convict states, it convicts individuals. And the reach of the International Criminal Court would be towards any of the leadership, militarily, political, and administrative, that have been fostering and encouraging the development of the settlements.
Well, the ICC obviously more famous for prosecuting black Africans than white people, arguably. Just very quickly on the Pegasus spyware, I think, is it your understanding that it could be used against all people, to track all people in the territories occupied since 1967, right now maybe?
First of all is the way in which these private Israeli and other cybersecurity companies have been able to sell their advanced cyber technology to countries around the world, including many authoritarian countries, has meant that these countries are able to use this advanced spyware on their own citizens, particularly with respect to political dissidents and those engaged in critical journalism. That is a grave breach of both the right to dissent as well as the right to privacy. Second, it shows that there is virtually no oversight, at least with respect to the Israeli government, who has to issue export licenses to these companies such as NSO to be able to send their spyware abroad. And there's a huge gap with respect to that, and perhaps suggests that there's been, a fair amount of collusion between the Israeli government and these spyware companies in sending this cyber security surveillance off to companies that Israel wants to be able to nourish a relationship. But the third big issue, which is the one that's not really been covered by these revelations over the past several weeks, is that this cyber spyware was developed on the Palestinian population over the last 3 and 4 decades. Most of these Israeli cybersecurity companies got their origins in what is called Unit 8200, which is the military unit devoted to surveillance of the Palestinian population. So what is used on Palestinians today is used on the world population tomorrow.
Well, obviously the NSO group denies any wrongdoing and says what it's doing is trying to create a peaceful and safer world. But Special Rapporteur, thank you.
Yeah. My pleasure.
After the break, we ask international human rights lawyer Arsalan Iftikhar what's driving the global fear of a Muslim planet. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Thanks for watching this Going Underground interview. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel with notifications on to never miss an interview. Now it's your turn. Tell us what you think by commenting below and getting in touch via our social media. See you next time. All that is solid melts into air.